My name is Caleb Merritt. I'm 31 years old. And the man my mother married when I was 9 years old took a sledgehammer to the kitchen I built with my own hands, the kitchen I spent $90,000 and 14 months of my life creating, while I was supposed to be at work. I want you to sit with that for a second. I came home early on a Tuesday afternoon in March because I'd left my laptop charger on the counter. That's all, a $12 charger. I pulled into the driveway of the house I own, in the neighborhood I chose, and before I even got out of the car I heard it, a sound I can only describe as a building being unmade, a deep rhythmic crash, then another, like someone knocking on the inside of the earth. I walked through my front door, and the first thing I saw was a cloud of white drywall dust floating through the hallway like snow in slow motion. The second thing I saw was my stepfather, Dennis Hargrove, standing in the middle of my kitchen in a pair of old work boots, holding a 12-pound sledgehammer and staring at the wall he had just caved in like he was proud of himself. He didn't hear me come in, and what I did next, what I said, what I didn't say, and what happened in the weeks that followed changed every single relationship in my life. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. This channel exists because people like you show up, and I feel every single one of you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. There are people reading your comment from places you've never heard of, and somehow, some way, we are all sitting with the same feelings tonight. Now, let me take you back. Let me take you back to the summer of 1999, to a neighborhood called Garrison Hills on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, where the houses were close enough together that you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall, and the sidewalks cracked every winter and never got fully fixed. I was 9 years old, and my mother, Sandra Merritt, she went by Sandy, had just introduced me and my older sister Vanessa to a man named Dennis Hargrove at a backyard barbecue hosted by our next-door neighbor. Dennis was 41 at the time, broad-shouldered, with a thick dark moustache and the kind of laugh that filled whatever room he was in. He brought a 12-pack of Budweiser and a bag of Kingsford charcoal, and he shook my hand like I was a grown man and said, "So you're the man of the house." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say to a 9-year-old. I remember my mother laughed when he said it. My father, Raymond Merritt, had left when I was 6. Not dramatically, not violently. He just slowly disappeared, the way a tide goes out. One week he was there, the next he was calling from an apartment in Dayton, and by the time I was 8, the calls were monthly, then quarterly, then almost never. My mother worked as a medical billing specialist at Grant Medical Center, 40 hours a week, sometimes 50. She was tired in the specific way that single mothers are tired, not just in the body, but in some place deeper, some place that doesn't show on the outside until you're old enough to recognize it looking back. Vanessa was 12 that summer, already in middle school, already building the invisible wall between herself and the rest of us that teenagers construct without realizing it. And I was 9, all elbows and curiosity, following my mother around the house asking questions she didn't always have the energy to answer. Dennis moved in 7 months after that barbecue. By the following spring, he and my mother were married at the county courthouse with Vanessa and me as witnesses, and my mother's sister, Aunt Cheryl, standing in as the photographer with a disposable Kodak camera. There was no party. There was a dinner at Applebee's afterward. I ordered the riblets because Dennis said I could get whatever I wanted. That was one of the last times I remember him saying that. I want to be precise about what kind of man Dennis Hargrove was, because I've spent years wrestling with the urge to flatten him into a villain, and I think the truth is more complicated and somehow more painful. He wasn't a monster. He didn't hit us. He didn't drink himself into rages. What he was, what he became almost immediately, was indifferent. Not to everyone. Specifically to me. Dennis had a son from his first marriage, a boy named Tyler, who was 7 when his parents divorced, and who lived with his mother Renee in Westerville, about 20 minutes north of us. Tyler came to stay with us every other weekend, and for 2 weeks every summer. And when Tyler was in the house, Dennis became a different person. He became warm. He became present. He became the kind of father you see in television commercials, tossing a football in the backyard, helping with homework at the kitchen table, laughing at everything the kids said like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I watched this transformation the way you watch a weather system come in off the lake. It was observable. It had a pattern. The weekend Tyler wasn't there, Dennis watched television, spoke to my mother about logistics, and treated me and Vanessa the way you treat furniture in a house you're renting. You notice it, you work around it, but you don't feel anything about it. There were specific moments. Let me give you the specific moments, because I think the specific moments are the only honest currency in a story like this. The first one I remember with real clarity. I was 11. I had made the travel baseball team for the Columbus East Side Youth League, not the recreational team, the competitive travel team, which required tryouts and which cost $400 a season for uniforms and tournament fees. I had worked on my swing all winter in the backyard with a batting tee and a bucket of balls that Coach Darnell Williams had lent me. I made the team on a Saturday morning in February, and I came home and told my mother, and she hugged me, and I was so proud I could barely stand it. Dennis was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. He looked up, he said, then he looked back down. My mother paid the $400 from her own account. When I asked her later that year why Dennis hadn't contributed, carefully, trying not to make it a bigger thing than it was, she said, "Dennis has a lot of expenses, baby." I told myself it didn't hurt. I was 11. I was getting very good at telling myself that. The second moment. I was 13, and my 8th grade class took a 4-day trip to Washington, D.C., the kind of trip that every kid in Columbus talked about from the moment they entered middle school. The cost was $380, due in 2 installments. My mother paid the first installment, $190. 2 weeks before the second installment was due, she sat me down and told me she was short that month, that the car had needed new brakes, and that she was going to need me to either ask Dennis to help or miss the trip. I was 13 and I had approximately $11 in a shoebox under my bed. I went to Dennis while he was watching the Ohio State game on a Saturday afternoon, and I asked him, as carefully and as respectfully as I knew how, if he could lend me the $190. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a lot of money, Caleb." I said I knew. He said he'd think about it. He never came back to me with an answer. I missed the trip. Every single one of my friends went. I spent that 4 days in April going to school and coming home to an empty house and heating up soup from a can and watching television and not crying, because I had already become, at 13, someone who did not let himself cry about things like this. I told myself it didn't hurt. Tyler, that same year, got a brand new Mongoose BMX bike for Christmas. It retailed for $229. I know because I looked it up in the Sports Authority catalog that came in the mail. I got a gift card to Target for $50, which my mother had purchased. I don't know if Dennis contributed to that. I never asked. Vanessa handled all of this differently than I did. She became hard and quiet, and by the time she was 16, she was spending most of her time at her best friend Dominique's house 3 streets over. And by 18, she was gone, a full scholarship to Ohio University, studying communications, building a life on her own terms with the particular ferocity of someone who has learned early that no one is coming to save them. She and I talked on the phone every couple of weeks during those years. She called Dennis that man and nothing else, and she did it with a kind of controlled contempt that I admired and envied in equal measure. My mother stayed. I understand why now, in a way I couldn't when I was young. She was tired, and she had found stability. And stability, when you've been without it, can feel enough like love to accept in its place. Dennis paid half the mortgage. Dennis was reliable. Dennis showed up. Those things matter. I know they matter. I'm not here to reduce my mother to a failure for choosing them, but here is the thing about a child who grows up feeling invisible in his own home. He either collapses inward or he builds. He either becomes the absence, or he becomes, slowly and deliberately and sometimes painfully, a person who refuses to be absent from his own life. I became a builder. I don't mean that metaphorically, though it is also true metaphorically. I mean I became, literally, a person who builds things. By the time I was 15, I was doing odd jobs for neighbors, painting fences, repairing deck boards, helping Mr. Patterson, 2 houses down, rebuild his garden shed after a storm took part of the roof. By 17, I was working summers for a small remodeling company called Stonebrook Renovations, run by a man named Gary Holtz, who was 55 years old and had the hands of someone who had spent 40 years in direct negotiation with wood and stone and steel. Gary paid me $11 an hour and taught me more in 2 summers than I learnt in 4 years of high school. He taught me how to read a blueprint, how to set tile, how to frame a wall, how to look at a broken thing and see the unbroken thing inside it waiting to be found. I went to Columbus State for 2 years, studied construction management, then transferred to Ohio State for my bachelor's. I graduated at 24 with a degree in architecture and a minor in business, and I had paid for roughly 60% of it myself through a combination of working for Gary during summers and holidays and a small academic scholarship I'd won in my sophomore year. My mother helped with the rest, and I will be grateful for that until I die. Dennis contributed nothing to my education, By that point, I had stopped expecting him to. By the time I was 27, I was working as a junior project manager for a mid-sized architecture and design firm in Columbus called Harkin & Slade. I was making $68,000 a year. I was saving aggressively, living in a one-bedroom apartment in the short north, and I had begun to understand, in the specific way that your late 20s sometimes teaches you if you're paying attention, that the life you want is not going to arrive. You have to go and take it by the throat. If you've grown up feeling like you had to build everything yourself, from scratch, with no one in your corner, type the word builder in the comments right now, because I see you. I have always been you. Here is where the kitchen comes in. In the spring of my 28th year, I bought a house. It was a 940 square foot craftsman bungalow in Clintonville, a neighborhood on the north side of Columbus that had been quietly, steadily gentrifying for a decade, and that still had, in certain blocks, the feeling of something real and lived in that newer neighborhoods never quite achieve. The house was built in 1924, and it had the bones, the original hardwood floors, the built-in bookshelves in the living room, the wide front porch with the tapered columns, but it had been through several decades of cosmetic updates that had buried those bones under laminate and drop ceilings and the particular beige of rental property management. I paid $312,000 for it. I put 20% down. The mortgage was $1,640 a month, which was manageable on my salary if I was disciplined about everything else. The kitchen, when I moved in, was a disaster. Original to the early 1970s, when the house had been significantly updated by a previous owner, it was approximately 280 square feet of harvest gold appliances, water-damaged particle board cabinets, a linoleum floor in a pattern that I can only describe as aggressively depressing, and a drop ceiling that was hiding, as I discovered when I pulled down the first tile, a network of original plaster that was crumbling, and a set of rough-hewn wooden beams that were, somehow, structurally perfect. The appliances didn't work properly. The layout was inefficient, with the refrigerator in a corner that required you to stand at an angle to open it fully. The single window above the sink looked out onto the driveway and had been painted shut, probably during the Reagan administration. I stood in that kitchen the first morning I owned the house, drinking coffee from a paper cup, and I thought, I am going to make something extraordinary here. I want to be clear about what the kitchen renovation became. It wasn't just a home improvement project. It was, and I know this sounds like something a person says when they're trying to make a renovation into something more than it was an act of self-authorship. Every single decision, the quartzite countertops from a supplier in Vermont, the custom white oak cabinets I designed myself and had built by a cabinet maker named Tomas Reyes who worked out of a shop in Grandview Heights, the farmhouse sink from a company in Portland, the 6-burner Wolf range that I saved for and agonized over and finally ordered on a Thursday night in October while sitting on my kitchen floor with a glass of whiskey. Every single decision was mine. For the first time in my life, I was making something that no one could take from me, in a space that was entirely, legally, irrevocably mine. The total cost of the renovation by the time it was complete was $91,430. I will give you the breakdown because I want you to understand what was in that room. $42,000 for the custom cabinetry and installation, $14,000 for the countertops, $8,000 for the Wolf range, $6,200 for the farmhouse sink and the waterworks fixtures I paired with it, $4,400 for the custom tile backsplash, a hand-painted Moroccan cement tile I'd found through an Etsy shop called Sufi Ceramics, run by a woman in Brooklyn named Nadia Khalil, who reproduced traditional fez patterns with modern colorways, $7,000 for the hardwood floor extension that matched the original floors throughout the rest of the house, $4,000 for the lighting, a combination of recessed cans and a custom pendant I'd found at an estate sale in Bexley that I'd had rewired by an electrician named Jorge Fuentes, who moonlighted as an antique restorer. The rest was labor, permits, plumbing, electrical, and the structural work on the ceiling that revealed those beams, and which, once we exposed and cleaned and oiled them, turned the whole room into something that made people stop in the doorway. I finished the renovation 14 months after I started it. I did most of the work myself on evenings and weekends, with help from Gary Holtz, who had retired but who showed up more Saturdays than not just because, I think, he loved the process, and from 2 of my colleagues at Harkin & Slade, a man named Marcus Webb who was the best finish carpenter I'd ever seen, and who owed me a favor from a project we'd worked on together the previous year. The last tile of the backsplash went up on a Saturday night in November. I took a photo of it and sent it to Vanessa, who wrote back, "It looks like you, exactly like you." I put my phone down and I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while, and I didn't say anything to anyone. My mother had visited twice during the renovation process. She'd walked through the space in its various states of becoming and said things like, "This is so beautiful, baby, and I can't believe you did all this yourself." She brought Dennis the second time, in September, when the cabinets were up and the countertops had just been installed. Dennis walked through the kitchen slowly, with his hands in his pockets, looking at everything with the expression of a man doing a calculation he doesn't want you to see. He said, "That's a lot of money to spend on a kitchen." I said, "It is." There was a pause. Then he said, "Must be nice." And I thought, yes, it must be. And I said nothing else. Here is the thing about Dennis Hargrove in the year that I bought the house and renovated the kitchen. He was in trouble. I didn't know the full extent of it yet, but the edges were visible if you knew where to look. He and my mother were still in the house in Garrison Hills. The mortgage was paid off. They owned it outright, which gave them a stability that I think Dennis had come to rely on, perhaps more than he understood. But Dennis's work situation had been deteriorating for several years. He'd spent most of his career as a mid-level manager at a distribution company called Midstate Logistics, and when Midstate was acquired by a larger firm in 2019, his position was absorbed and restructured, and he was offered a lateral move that was in practice a demotion. He took it. Then, in 2021, his department was eliminated entirely in a cost-cutting round. Dennis was 59 years old and out of work for the first time since he was 22. This is where I will give credit where it is due. My mother did not panic. She had her own income, modest but steady, and the house was theirs and they had savings. They would be fine. But Dennis, at 59, had discovered something about himself that I don't think he'd ever wanted to know. That his sense of himself as a man was almost entirely constructed from his professional identity and his ability to provide. And when that was taken from him, he became someone he didn't recognize and didn't much like. He also became, I noticed during family dinners and Sunday afternoon visits, someone who had opinions about my house. It started subtly. A comment at Thanksgiving 2021, 7 months after I'd moved in, about how the open floor plan between the kitchen and the living room was drafty. A remark in March 2022 when I'd had a group of friends over for dinner, and Dennis and my mother had stopped by unannounced, which I'd asked them not to do, which I'd asked gently, and which Dennis had received by making a face that he probably thought I didn't notice, about how the kitchen was nice but impractical. I'd asked him what he meant by impractical. He gestured vaguely at the layout and said, "You'd have to live here a while to understand," as if I hadn't spent 14 months living there while building it with my own hands. The comments accumulated slowly enough that I kept filing them away rather than confronting them. I was raised, by my mother and by circumstance, to smooth things over, to choose the longer road around the conflict. It was a skill that had served me well professionally. I was good in rooms with difficult clients, good at finding the version of a problem that everyone could live with, and it had cost me personally a great deal. I was working on it. I was 30 years old and I was working on it. Then, in July of 2022, something happened that clarified everything. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. She sounded tentative in the way she sounds when she has something to say that she's been organizing for a while. She told me that Dennis had been having a hard time, that he was feeling purposeless, that he had always been handy, and that he had been talking about doing some projects around the house, their house, but that what he really needed, she thought, was a project that felt significant, that gave him back the feeling of building something. She paused. Then she said, he was wondering if he could help with the house. I asked what she meant by help. She said Dennis had some ideas about the basement, that he thought the unfinished basement could be converted into a nice rec room or a guest suite, and that he could do most of the work himself, and that it would give him something to do and it would add value to the house. I want to be honest about my reaction. My first reaction was not anger. My first reaction was a complicated mixture of something that might have been sympathy, because I do understand what it is to need a project, and something that was closer to alarm, because I had watched Dennis work on things, and I knew that his confidence with tools was not matched by his actual skill, and I had spent $31,000 finishing the main floor of that house, and I was not interested in seeing an amateur with a purpose-driven crisis take a swing at it. I told my mother I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. I called Vanessa, Vanessa said, and I am quoting her directly, "Caleb, do not let that man within 10 feet of that house with a power tool. I'm telling you." I laughed. I thought she was being hyperbolic. I called my mother back on a Saturday morning and I said, carefully, that I appreciated the thought, but that I wasn't ready to take on a basement project right now. Which was true. I had a list of things I still wanted to do on the main floor, and I hadn't even begun to think seriously about the basement, and that I would let her know when I was. My mother received this with a long pause and then said, "Okay, baby." I could hear Dennis in the background. I could hear her relay my answer to him. I could hear him say, muffled, something that included the word unappreciative. My mother said louder, "Dennis," in the specific warning tone that I had heard her use approximately 6,000 times in my childhood. When he said something she didn't want to have to deal with, I let it go. I should not have let it go. In the autumn of 2022, Dennis began showing up at my house. Not unannounced, he would text first, which my mother had clearly insisted upon, but with a frequency and a purposefulness that felt off. He'd come over while I was at work on days when my mother had given him my schedule. She didn't mean harm by it, she was trying to coordinate visits, and he'd walk around the outside of the house, which I knew because my neighbour Mrs. Okafor, who was 73 and had the most comprehensive surveillance awareness of anyone I've ever met, told me one afternoon when I was getting my mail that broad man with the moustache had been walking around your side yard for about 20 minutes on Thursday. I texted my mother and asked her to ask Dennis to please not come by when I wasn't home. She said she would. He came by twice more. Mrs. Okafor told me both times, "I want you to understand that I was trying to be a good son. I want you to understand that I was holding in one hand my very real feelings about Dennis Hargrove, and in the other hand my love for my mother who loved him, and I was trying to find the grip that let me hold both." I sent Dennis a text directly in November 2022, the first time I had texted him directly in probably 2 years, and said, "Hey Dennis, I heard you've been coming by the house. I'd love it if you reached out before stopping by so I can be there. Hope you're doing well." He read it. He didn't respond. If you've ever tried to set a boundary with someone who treats your boundaries like suggestions, type the word boundary in the comments. I see every single one of you. The following March 7th, 2023, a Tuesday, I left for work at my usual time. 7:45 a.m, I was driving to a site visit for a project we were managing in Dublin, a mixed-use development that required me to be on site by 9. I got to Dublin, parked, reached into my bag for my laptop, found everything except the charger. I had left it on the kitchen counter, plugged into the outlet next to the refrigerator, where I always left it at night so it would be charged by morning. I had simply walked out without it. The site visit was going to run until at least 2 in the afternoon, and I needed the laptop to be charged for a 3 o'clock call with a client in Chicago. I drove back to Clintonville. It took me 22 minutes. I was listening to a podcast about urban planning. I was thinking about the Dublin project, and a detail in the site plan that wasn't resolving itself the way I wanted it to. I pulled into my driveway just before 10 in the morning, and then I heard it. The sound. That deep, rhythmic, unmistakable crash of something heavy meeting something structural with intent. Once, twice, 3 times, a pause. Then again, I sat in my car for, I think, about 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds my body understood something that my mind was still trying to catch up with. My hands were cold, my ears were ringing slightly, the way they do when your nervous system is trying to tell you something before your rational mind is ready to receive it. I got out of the car. I walked to my front door. The door was unlocked. My front door, which I had locked when I left at 7:45, was unlocked. I opened it. The dust was the first thing, hanging in the hallway like fog, white and fine, the kind of particulate that you know before you breathe it is going to sit in your lungs for a while. The kitchen is straight back from the front door, past the living room on the right and the dining area on the left, visible through the wide opening that I had spent 3 days framing out to get exactly right. I walked down the hallway. I didn't run. I'm not sure I was capable of running. I was moving through a space that had become, in the span of about 40 seconds, somehow both completely familiar and completely alien. I stood in the opening to my kitchen. Dennis Hargrove was standing in the center of the room. He was wearing the old work boots and a pair of canvas work pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. In his hands was a 12-pound sledgehammer, a real one, the kind you use to demo load-bearing walls, not the 4-pound kind you'd use for tile. He had his back to me. He was facing what had been, 30 seconds ago, the wall between my kitchen and the small utility alcove that ran along the north side of the house, a wall that, while not load-bearing, contained the rough electrical for the under-cabinet lighting and the plumbing supply line for the farmhouse sink. Or rather, he was facing what was left of it. There was a hole in that wall approximately 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall, raw edges of drywall crumbling, a burst of plaster dust still settling, a tangle of yellow electrical wire hanging from the ragged opening like nerve endings. The farmhouse sink was vibrating. I could see the water in the basin trembling slightly from the impact. The Safi ceramics backsplash tile on the adjacent wall had cracked in 3 places, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from a single impact point on the second tile from the left. The cabinet door on the lower run had been knocked from one of its hinges and was hanging at an angle. There was debris on the countertops, on the floor, on the wolf range. Dennis raised the sledgehammer again. I said his name, just that. Just Dennis. He spun around, and for one moment, one single, specific moment that I have replayed so many times since that I could draw it from memory, I saw his face before he had time to arrange it. Before the explanation, before the defense, before whatever story he had prepared, I saw something raw and complicated and ugly in that face. Something that wasn't just surprise at being caught, something that had been living in him for a long time. Then his face changed, and he said, "Caleb, I was going to—" I held up my hand. I said, "Stop." He stopped. I looked at my kitchen. I looked at the hole in the wall, at the cracked tile, at the cabinet door hanging from its single hinge, at the fine white coating of drywall dust that had settled over the countertops and the farmhouse sink, and the 6-burner wolf range. I looked at the hammer in his hands. I looked at Dennis Hargrove, who was 59 years old and standing in my kitchen having destroyed, in what I estimated was less than 20 minutes, somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 of my work. I said, "Put the hammer down." He put the hammer down. I said, "How did you get in?" There was a pause. He said, "Sandy gave me a key. My mother, who I had given a key to for emergencies, had given it to Dennis. I absorbed this. I filed it. I would come back to it." I said, "What were you doing?" He started to explain. The explanation, and I'm going to try to give it to you fairly because fairness is what I was reaching for, even in that moment, and fairness is what I still believe in, was this. Dennis had decided, on his own, without asking me, without calling me, without any conversation, that the wall between the kitchen and the utility alcove was inefficient, and that removing it would give the kitchen better flow and space for a larger island. He had, he said, been thinking about it for months. He had drawings, he actually used that word, drawings, that he wanted to show me. He had watched videos, he knew what he was doing. He said that last part while standing in front of a wall he had partially demolished, and through which I could see a burst water supply line beginning, slowly, to drip. I walked past him and turned off the water supply valve under the sink. Then I stood up, and I turned around, and I looked at him for a long time. And then I said, "I need you to leave my house." He started to speak. I said, "Not right now, Dennis. I need you to leave my house right now, and I need you to not come back until I call you." He picked up the sledgehammer, I think as a reflex, the way you gather your things when you're asked to leave a room, and then seemed to realize what he was doing and set it back down. He walked to the front door. He stopped in the hallway and turned around and said, "I was trying to help you," and I know that he believed that. I know that somewhere in the wreckage of whatever Dennis Hargrove was going through, that sentence was true. I said, "I know." He left. I stood in my kitchen for a while. The drip from the supply line had stopped. The valve had worked. The dust was still settling. It was 10:23 in the morning. I had a site visit I had left 22 minutes ago, and a 3 o'clock call with a client in Chicago, and a kitchen that had been partially destroyed by a man who had been, for better and worse and everything in between, the closest thing to a father I'd had for 22 years. I called Marcus Webb. Marcus, who was my colleague and my friend and who had helped me build this kitchen with his own hands on his own time, answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Marcus said, "I'm coming over." I said I didn't want to pull him from work. He said, "I'm coming over." He was there in 40 minutes. Marcus assessed the damage quietly and thoroughly, the way a doctor examines a patient, not emotional about it, just systematic. He checked the electrical. He pulled out a section of the broken wall to get a clearer look at the plumbing. He crouched down and examined the cracked tile with a flashlight, running his fingertip along the fracture lines. He stood up and said, "Okay, the electrical is compromised. You've got exposed wiring that needs to be properly capped and rerun before you can use the under-cabinet lights. The supply line has a hairline crack right at the joint from the vibration that needs to be replaced, not just patched. The tile is a loss on 3 panels. The cabinet door hinge is fixable. The wall itself," he paused and looked at the hole, "the wall itself is structural in the sense that it's supporting the load of the cabinet run above it on the left side, which Dennis apparently didn't account for. If he'd hit it twice more, he'd have compromised the support for those uppers." He looked at me. "You got there when you did?" I nodded. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, I'm going to figure out what this costs, and then I'm going to figure out what to do about it. Over the next 3 days, I documented everything. I photographed every inch of the damage. I had Jorge Fuentes, the electrician who had done the original wiring, come and assess the electrical damage. His estimate for repair was $1,600. I had a plumber named Aaron Devitt, who had done work for me before, look at the supply line, $420 to replace properly. The tile, I called Nadia Khalil at Safi Ceramics in Brooklyn. The 3 damaged panels were from a limited run that was no longer in current production. She could do a new order of matching tile, but the minimum order was a full set, $1,100 plus shipping. Marcus confirmed the wall repair, drywall, skim coat, structural reinforcement of the upper cabinet run. He estimated $800 in materials, and he offered his labor for free, which I refused, and we settled on his going rate, which brought the total to $1,400 for that portion. Cabinet hinge, $40 in hardware, 30 minutes of Marcus's time. Total documented cost of what Dennis Hargrove did on the morning of March 7th, 2023, in 20 minutes with a 12-pound sledgehammer. $5,560. That number is important. Hold on to it. I called my mother the evening of March 7th. She answered and said, "Caleb, I'm so sorry," which told me that Dennis had already spoken to her, which told me that there had already been a version of events transmitted in my absence. I asked her to let me tell her what had happened first, before she said anything else. She was quiet, I told her, calmly, with specifics, without raising my voice. I told her about the hole in the wall and the cracked tile and the electrical and the plumbing and the cabinet door. I told her what it was going to cost. I told her that her key had been used to access my home without my permission. And then I was quiet. My mother said, "He meant well, Caleb." And there it was. The sentence that had been the dominant chord of my entire childhood, running underneath everything like a bass note. He means well. He tries. Give him credit for trying, as if intention were a currency that could be spent on consequences. I said, "Mum, I know he meant well. He's caused $5,000 of damage to my home, and he let himself in with a key that I gave to you for emergencies." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I'd like Dennis to pay for the repairs." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Caleb, Dennis isn't working right now. You know that?" I said, "I know. A payment plan is fine. I'm not trying to create a hardship. I'm asking for the damage to be acknowledged and for the cost to be covered." She said she'd talk to him. She called me back 2 days later and reported, with the careful neutrality of someone who is trying not to take sides while clearly being implicated on one, that Dennis felt the damage was overstated and that he had been trying to improve the space and that he thought we should all sit down as a family and talk about this. I said, "Okay, let's sit down." We sat down the following Sunday at my mother's house in Garrison Hills. The kitchen table where Dennis had once read the newspaper while I'd told him I'd made the travel baseball team. Dennis was at the head of the table. My mother was at the other end. I sat along the side, and for a moment I was 9 years old, and coming home from practice, and setting my mitt down by the back door. I put a folder on the table. It contained the photographs of the damage, the 3 repair estimates from Jorge, Aaron, and Marcus, and a 1-page summary I had written that laid out the documented costs clearly and without editorializing. I slid it across to Dennis. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He said, "I was trying to help you." I said, "I know you were, and I need you to look at what happened when you did." He said, "That tile would have cracked eventually anyway. That's cheap tile." I want to pause here, because what he said about that tile, hand-painted Moroccan cement tile, made by Nadia Khalil in Brooklyn, at $112 per panel, and the way he said it, the dismissiveness of it, the way he reduced it to cheap tile, as if my 11 years of becoming the kind of person who could afford and choose and install something beautiful were nothing, as if the whole kitchen were nothing, as if I were nothing. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt something I can only describe as a complete absence of surprise, because this is who Dennis Hargrove had always been to me. Not a monster, just a man who had never once in 22 years found a way to see me. I said, "The tile is $1,100 a panel in a limited run that's no longer in production." He looked at me. Then he looked at my mother. My mother said, "Dennis," he said, "Sandy, I was trying to do something nice." And my mother looked at him with something in her face that I don't think I'd ever seen there before. A fatigue, not the tired from work fatigue I'd grown up with. Something deeper, something that had been building for a while, and that perhaps my phone call 3 days ago had brought to a surface it had been very close to anyway. She said, Dennis, you went into our son's house without his permission, and you damaged his things. Whether you meant well doesn't change what happened. Our son. She said our son. I registered that. I filed it in a different place from the repair estimates. Dennis sat with this for a moment. Then he said, I don't have $5,000 right now, Caleb. You know that. I said, a payment plan, $500 a month, no interest. That gives you 11 months. He looked at the folder. He looked at me, and he said, and this is the part that I keep coming back to, the part that is both the worst thing and somehow also the most honest thing he ever said to me. He said, why is it always about money with you? And I thought, because money is the language of the things you did and didn't do, because $400 for baseball and $190 for the DC trip and $229 for Tyler's bike and 60% of my college education and 22 years of your complete emotional absence all add up to something, Dennis. And yes, I am asking you to acknowledge that something in the only unit of measure you've ever responded to. I didn't say any of that. I said, it's not about money. It's about my home. There was a long silence at that table. Long enough that I was aware of the refrigerator humming and the sound of a car going by outside and the specific quality of afternoon light coming through the window over the sink where my mother always kept a small pot of herbs on the sill. The same herbs for 30 years, rosemary and basil, and one sad little parsley plant that never quite thrived. Then Dennis said, quietly, I'll think about a payment plan. I said, okay. I stood up. I picked up my folder. I put on my jacket. And then I did something that I hadn't planned to do, something that came from somewhere I hadn't accessed in a long time. I stopped at the door, and I turned around and I looked at Dennis, who was still sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface, and I said, I have wanted for a very long time for you to be proud of what I've built. I still do. That's the part that I don't know what to do with. And I left. Have you ever said the true thing, the most honest, most vulnerable thing to the person least likely to receive it? If you have, type the word truth in the comments, because I believe that saying it out loud, even when it lands on silence, is still something. It still counts. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a rupture. My mother called twice a week, the way she always had. We talked about her work, about Vanessa, who was now living in Atlanta with her partner Jerome and their 2-year-old daughter, about the spring coming in and the garden she was putting in along the side of the house. We did not directly talk about Dennis. I called Marcus and he started the repairs the second week of April. Jorge came for the electrical. Aaron came for the plumbing. I ordered the new tile from Nadia Khalil in Brooklyn and paid the rush charge to have it in within 10 days. By the end of April, the kitchen was whole again. I stood in it the evening the last tile went up, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just relief, something closer to, I want to choose the right word here, clarity. The thing that had been murky and complicated and swallowed down for 22 years was now visible. It was on the table. It had a dollar amount and a date and a set of photographs. It couldn't be filed away anymore. And here is where the story turns. In May of 2023, Harkin and Slade was approached by a development group out of Cincinnati about a major project in the short north, a mixed-use development on a former industrial site that included residential units, ground floor retail, and, most significantly for me, a public courtyard and kitchen space that would serve as a community hub for the surrounding neighborhood. The project had a budget of $11 million and a 2-year timeline. My firm was competing against 3 other firms for the contract. My principal, David Harkin, asked me to lead our proposal. I worked on that proposal for 6 weeks. I ate at my desk, I took my laptop to the kitchen, and worked from there on weekends, surrounded by the thing I had rebuilt, and I drew on everything Gary Holtz had ever taught me, and everything I'd learned at Ohio State, and everything I had understood about space and how people move through it, and what it means to make a place where someone feels, at last, that they belong. The proposal was 47 pages long. It included a detailed narrative of the design philosophy, a structural analysis, a community engagement plan, and a set of renderings that Marcus helped me prepare, and that I am genuinely proud of to this day. We won the contract on June 14, 2023. David Harkin called me into his office and shook my hand, and told me that the development group had specifically cited the narrative design philosophy section as the reason they chose us over the other 3 firms. He told me that effective immediately I would be promoted to senior project manager and that my salary would be adjusted to $93,000 annually with a performance bonus structure tied to the project's completion. He told me that my name would be on the project as lead designer. He told me he was proud of me. I drove home from work that evening, and I sat in my kitchen at the island that I had designed and Tomas had built, and that Dennis Hargrove had been trying, in his way, to make room for. And I had a glass of scotch, and I called Vanessa. She answered, and I said, I got the project. She screamed. She actually screamed. Her daughter started crying in the background, and then I could hear Jerome laughing and telling the little girl it was okay, and Vanessa saying, Uncle Caleb got the project, baby. That's why Mama's screaming. And I sat in my kitchen and I laughed until my eyes were wet. Then I called my mother. She cried. She said, I always knew, Caleb, I always knew. And I believed her. I believed that she had always known. And I sat with the complexity of loving someone who always knew, and who had also, for 22 years, asked you to make room for the person who didn't. Dennis had not yet paid the first installment of the payment plan. He had not called me. He had not texted me. The absence was the answer, and the answer was consistent with 22 years of data, and I had, somewhere in the process of building and rebuilding and winning and grieving, made a kind of peace with the data. Then in July, something happened that I didn't see coming. Tyler called me. Tyler Hargrove, Dennis's son, who was 31 now, my age almost exactly, who I had grown up parallel to, who I had watched receive the father I was also technically assigned. Tyler called me on a Wednesday evening from his home in Westerville, and he said, Caleb, I heard what my dad did. I'm sorry. I was so surprised I didn't respond right away. He said, my mum told me. She still talks to your mum. I've known about it for a few weeks, and I've been trying to figure out what to say, and I think the honest thing is just to say I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. I grew up with that man, and I love him, and I also know exactly what he's capable of, and I'm sorry. I said, Tyler. He said, yeah. I said, thank you. That means something. There was a pause. Then he said, he talks about your kitchen, you know. He's talked about it for 2 years. He walks around his own house saying the fixtures and the lighting and the layout are wrong. And I think seeing what you built did something to him that he didn't know how to handle. Another pause. That's not an excuse. I wanted you to know. I held that information for a long time after I hung up. I'm still holding it. Here is the thing about a person who has made you feel invisible. Sometimes the worst thing is discovering that they saw you perfectly well, that you were never invisible to them, that the problem wasn't that they couldn't see you. The problem was that seeing you made them feel something they didn't know how to sit with. Envy, maybe, or shame, or something that doesn't have a clean name. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still working on it. In August, 6 months after the morning with the sledgehammer, my mother called me and told me that Dennis had been offered a part-time consulting position with a small logistics company in Worthington, that he was going to start in September, that she thought it was going to be good for him. I said I was glad to hear it. I meant it. Then she said, he wants to talk to you. I said, okay. She said, he's not good at this, Caleb. He doesn't know how to. She stopped. Then she said, he's going to try. Dennis called me the following Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. I was in the kitchen making coffee. He said, Caleb. I said, Dennis. He said, I owe you money. I said, yes. He said, I'm going to set up the payment starting in October, $500 a month like you said. I said, okay, thank you. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and that contained, I think, approximately 40 years of things neither of us knew how to say. Then Dennis said, your mother showed me the article in the Columbus Monthly about the Short North project. I said, yeah. He said, they quoted you, the thing about architecture being an act of care. I said, yeah. He said, I thought that was good, what you said. I said, thank you, Dennis. Another pause. Then, your kitchen is beautiful, Caleb. I should have said that a long time ago. I held the phone and looked at my kitchen. The white oak cabinets, the quartzite, the hand-painted tile now whole again, the beams overhead, the morning light coming through the window I had unblocked 2 years ago. I said, yay, it is. Then I said, come see it sometime. Properly. He said, I'd like that. That was all. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a healing. It was a sentence, followed by another sentence, and maybe the beginning of something that might one day be a conversation. I am not going to tell you that the phone call repaired what 22 years had done. That would be a lie, and this channel has never been a place for lies. But I'm going to tell you that I sat in my kitchen after I hung up, and I drank my coffee, and I let the morning be what it was. Dennis made the first payment in October. He's made every payment since. 3 months left on the plan. Vanessa came to visit in September with Jerome and the baby. She walked into the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a long moment and then said, It's still exactly like you. The baby, whose name is Lena, pulled herself to standing on the cabinet door and looked up at me with the enormous, uncomplicated confidence of a 1-year-old who has never been required to make herself smaller. I picked her up and she grabbed my face with both hands, and I thought, yes, this is what it's for, all of it. The 14 months and the $91,000 and the sledgehammer and the repair estimates and the phone calls and the 5 seconds of silence on the line with Dennis. All of it is for this moment of a child in your kitchen who trusts you completely. The Short North project is currently 15 months in and on schedule. Marcus Webb is on the construction team. Gary Holtz has come to the site twice, both times uninvited, both times welcome, both times standing in whatever space we're working on with his hands in his pockets, and that expression on his face that I've come to understand means he approves. The community kitchen at the center of the courtyard is framed and plumbed and is, in my completely unbiased professional opinion, going to be one of the most beautiful public spaces Columbus has ever seen. I am 31 years old. I own a house with a kitchen that cost me $91,000, and that was damaged and repaired, and that is, like everything worth having, both a thing I built and a thing I continue to build. I have a mother who loves me and is imperfect and chose badly in some ways and will be my mother until one of us is gone. I have a sister who got out and became ferocious and calls me every Sunday. I have Gary Holtz, who is 61 and retired, and who I call my mentor without embarrassment. I have Marcus Webb, who showed up in 40 minutes with a flashlight and no questions. I have a job that puts my name on buildings. I have a kitchen where I cook for people I love. I have a stepfather who destroyed something I made and who is paying for it, $500 at a time, which is not the point. The point is that he called it beautiful, and I said, come see it. Here is what I want to leave you with. I spent a long time believing that what I was doing, the building, the saving, the $91,000 kitchen, the winning of contracts, was a response to Dennis Hargrove, a rebuttal, a letter written in hardwood and quartzite and hand-painted Moroccan tile, addressed to everyone who had ever treated me like furniture in a house they were renting. And there is truth in that. I'm not going to pretend the anger wasn't fuel. It was fuel. It burned clean, and it got me somewhere real. But somewhere in the months between the sledgehammer and the Saturday morning phone call, I understood something that changed the way I hold all of it. The kitchen was never really about Dennis. The kitchen was about me. The 14 months and the $91,000 and the beams and the wolf range and the tile from Brooklyn, that was me choosing, over and over again, to believe that I deserved beauty, that the space I occupy in the world is worth filling with care, that I am not furniture, that I am in fact the architect. This isn't revenge. This is architecture. You build the thing that tells the truth about who you are. You build it in the face of the people who can't see it, and you build it in gratitude for the people who can, and you build it most importantly for yourself, for the 9-year-old who sat in the back of a car listening to his mother relay the answer no, and who told himself it didn't hurt, and who has now, at 31, built something so beautiful that even the person who swung the sledgehammer called it beautiful in the end. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt like your own, then you already know what to do with it. You build, you keep building. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your story in the comments. Not the whole story, just the thing you built after the thing you lost. I read every single one. Check the description for another story from this channel that I think you need to hear next. I'll be in the kitchen.